Morning, everyone. This is the question. If your voice could be heard by the Prime Minister, what would you ask him to do? Even if you don't think he'll do it, just one thing, right? If you had the ear of the Prime Minister for 30 seconds or something like that, and he said, "Tell me what," and I'll go for it, what would it be? All right. So don't, as I say, get into anything that's majorly divisive or passionate. Just something that if you had the ear of the Prime Minister, what is one thing you would say? Go for it. Discuss that for about a minute. All right. Well, let's finish up there. I'm sure some of you were able to launch into some great discussion there. For some of you, it may have been, something really deep and profound. We had, treatment of refugees and, the issues of vaccinations and things like that. There may have been some, trivial things like, I don't know, something that's just really silly, They actually asked me, "What would yours be, Phil?" And I said, "Oh, no, I couldn't work it out. It was, so I dodged the bullet. That's why I was asking you, because I didn't know, I don't know where I would start with that." But anyway, that's it was just a question to get us thinking a little bit about a theme that may come up later on. So we're continuing through our Testament series, looking at Genesis to Revelation and the grand story of how we piece this whole thing together rather than just 10,000 or so stories in the middle and we get a profound truth out of each. What is the big story that God is telling through Genesis to Revelation, and how does it impact us today? And I can tell you that while you can look at all those 10,000 individual little things, and you can go through your entire Christian life looking at little stories or teachings or whatever through all this, your whole Christian life, and that might be well and good, but until you get the grand story of Genesis to Revelation and the big picture of what God is doing, I don't think you get anywhere close to what God is desiring for us in terms of his purpose for us as his people, nor the hope and joy that is available to us in this life. So please stick with us. Hopefully through this journey, you're getting a greater picture of what goes on in this grand story. So to recap, we've gone through, and I'm going to race through this. Act 1, creation. God establishes his kingdom. It was very good. Then along comes Adam and Eve and the serpent, and everything starts to unravel. There's rebellion in the kingdom, and the very good creation that God had made is no longer very good. God establishes a restoration project. Rather than abandoning it, he goes, "I'm going to restore this and renew it and bring it back to the beauty of the created order." And the big part of that is his selection of a people group called Israel to be his restoration plan on earth. So through Abraham, he creates the nation of Israel and promises them two things: land and a people. People and land. Oh, hang on, nowhere. We've got to go back, Raj. There we go. All right. So he promises people and land, and that is fulfilled. And the purpose of that is that this would be a holy people. They would be devoted to the worship of God, devoted to revealing his character to the world. So they would be a light to the nations, and a holy land, a place devoted to the worship of Yahweh and Yahweh alone. That they would get rid of all the idols and false gods in there and have a place that was his for his worship alone, right? So a holy people and a holy land. And as Will looked at last week, through a period of judges and all sorts of things, eventually they get to a point where as a people they say, "Listen, we don't want you as God to be our king. We want a human king like all the other nations." And bang, immediately there you get a major point where the people have said, the God who has called us to be a holy nation, distinct from all the other nations, we want to be like all the other nations. Do you get the irony of that? We want a king who will rule over us like all the other nations. So they're saying the primary calling that God has for them, they are rejecting. We want to actually be like all the other nations. God warns them of what's going to happen. They don't listen, demand a king anyway. In comes Saul. He's pretty average. And then in comes David. And that's where Will finished off last week, that the 12 tribes of Israel, and so we'll go to the map, the 12 tribes of Israel, all there in different colors, form the one nation, the one kingdom under King David. And as Will concluded last week, Israel is basically at its peak at this point under King David. Despite David himself being a very flawed leader who faces significant threats and challenges to his reign, David is a humble, repentant, God-devoted king who leads Israel to become a flourishing, strong nation where there is peace in the land and a people that are largely devoted to the worship of Yahweh. And during his reign, God makes this promise to David in 2 Samuel 7:16. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So God promises to David that his reign, his throne, will be a forever kingdom. Effectively, a descendant of David will forever be on the throne of Israel. And this becomes a really important promise for the people of Israel. They cling on to this as assurance of their prosperity as a nation, because they live in the midst of a whole lot of nations who don't like them and they don't like, and there's just, superpower after superpower kind of trying to destroy each other and gather dominion and all that sort of stuff. So them being there and God saying, David, you will forever have somebody on the throne of Israel, was something like, oh, wow. The God who's redeemed us from Egypt and conquered them, brought us out, given us victory over all of these Canaanites and established us now in the land, is promising us that we are going to be here and we are going to have a king on the throne forever. That's a pretty good promise, right? And they're clinging on to that, going, right, this is who we are. Yahweh has us as his chosen people. So they cling on to this promise that they would be protected by God as his people forever. So after ruling for 40 years, David grows old and his health fails. So he anoints Solomon to take his son to take the throne as king. And Solomon starts pretty well. He asks God for the gift of wisdom, which God grants, as well as great riches and honor. Solomon's wisdom becomes legendary. He is an expert in proverbial wisdom. He has extensive knowledge of the world, things like plants, animals, reptiles, and fish. He is credited with creating a developed structure of governance for Israel and for dealing shrewdly with surrounding nations. So whereas his father David was renowned for his heart after God and his military leadership, Solomon is renowned for his wisdom. Many of his insights are noted in books like Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. You will have read them. They're just practical sort of life wisdom about understanding how to live faithfully in a good though fallen world, and understanding that a flourishing human life is best lived when a fear of the Lord is the starting point. Right? So the wisdom that Solomon gains from God is to say that a flourishing human life, the best way that human life is lived, is to start, the very first building block is a fear of the Lord, is to understand who God is. And once you start with that, everything else can fall into place. Right? And that's where Proverbs and Ecclesiastes kind of builds from. But Solomon's greatest achievement, however, as king, is constructing God's permanent temple in Jerusalem to replace the tabernacle that had been carried with them through the wilderness. So the tabernacle was kind of the mobile tent where the Ark of the Covenant would sit, and that would be God's presence with them. Now that they're in the land, Solomon creates or constructs this temple. And using only the best materials and sparing no cost, Solomon leads the construction of a magnificent temple designed to reflect the glory of the Lord. The Ark of the Covenant that contained the stone tablets of the law is brought into the temple to mark the fulfillment of the Israelites' journey out of slavery in Egypt to the land that God has given them. And when the Ark is deposited in the temple, the cloud that guided them through the wilderness. You will remember the story of the great cloud leading them through the wilderness towards the promised land. When the Ark of the Covenant goes into the temple, the cloud fills the temple as a symbol of God's presence within that temple. And the temple becomes, therefore, the symbolic location of God's presence amongst his people. So the temple is now this representation that the journey from slavery and bondage in Egypt, through all of that time, the promise of God is now fulfilled. We are the people in the land, and we are settled with our God in the land. So the temple is a hugely significant thing for the people of Israel. So Israel and God himself are now at rest in the land. And we talked about that concept of rest. And Solomon says this at the dedication of the temple in 1 Kings 8. Praise be to the Lord. He's saying this to all the people, who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the good promises he gave through his servant Moses. And so the temple, placed right in the middle of the city of Jerusalem, which is right smack bang in the middle of the nation of Israel, becomes the centerpiece of Israel's identity. It is a symbol of God's presence amongst his people. It is a place where they can pray and be heard by God. And Jerusalem itself becomes the center for Israel's formal worship, where pilgrims would come from all over Israel, and even to this day, all over the world, to offer praise and sacrifice to God. At this point in history, it appears that Israel may indeed be close to being the holy nation and the light to the nations, the blessing to all nations that God had called them to be. It looks at this point like God's plan of restoration through Abraham and the people of Israel may just work. This is good. This is exciting. But there's a problem. And that warning from last week that you'll remember when Samuel the prophet said, you're rejecting God as your king, and if you get a human king, this is what's going to happen. It's not going to work well for you. Well, this is where it starts to come in. Demanding a human king wasn't going to work well. Human kings are fallen, and they are human. They won't reign perfectly. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. Firstly, Solomon begins to use forced labor to fulfill his ambitious building plans. He's not just building the temple, he then goes and builds a whole lot of other things, establishing his sort of kingdom, and he starts using forced labor of the people of Israel. Secondly, he does not oppose the worship of God at the high places where the Baals used to be worshipped by the Canaanites, right? So up in, I meant to get that little laser pointer. Oh, if someone could run that down, that'd be awesome. But so in these 12 sort of tribal areas, now it's become one nation. But all around, because this was the land of Canaan, there were all these locations where the Canaanites used to worship Baals, and they called them high places, right? And what God had said was, no, thank you very much, Dan. Give him a round of applause. What do I press again? Laser. There you go. All right. So there's all these little high places scattered around. But God said, no, I'm coming into Jerusalem and building the temple, and that is where I want the worship of God to happen. Remember, we need to make sure that this place, this land is dedicated and devoted to Yahweh only. But the problem is, Solomon went, yeah, it's all right. You can start worshiping God at those temples of Baal. And it was a little bit of a dodgy kind of compromise on the command of God. They weren't obeying it fully. So it started to kind of get a little bit, diluted, a little bit watered down was this worship of Yahweh. It was no longer devoted just to him because they would also incorporate some of the cool bits that they thought of Canaanite worship. Thirdly, he takes some of the Canaanite women who were still in the land as wives, opening himself up to the dangers of idolatry. So women who had been worshipping Baal for their own lives, decades, all of a sudden had a very, very close ear to the king. That's where the question comes in before, right? And so these Canaanite women would go, well, listen, I want to worship the Baal. I've been doing that for my life. I want to continue to do that. And Solomon, even though he was wise, went, yeah, sure. Okay, you can continue to do that. And all of a sudden, you've got this compromise between worship of Yahweh and worship of Baals. And gradually, Solomon's devotion to God is diluted. His wisdom wanes and his use of forced labor alienates the people. So by the time of his death, he faces resentment by the people and rejection by God. And this is where it finishes at 1 Kings 11. This is where Solomon's reign comes to an end. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. And this is where we come to Act 4. Restoration falters. True to God's word, as a result of his disobedience, after Solomon dies, the nation of Israel splits into two kingdoms. And so this is the map that Will had last week, see, identifying the 12 tribes. And if you take the outer thing, that's the nation of Israel. But it splits into two tribes. The 10 northern tribes swear allegiance to Solomon's general, Jeroboam, and form the northern kingdom of Israel, with the capital being Samaria. And the two southern tribes give their allegiance to the rightful heir, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and they form the southern kingdom, Judah. So in the space of about 100 years, Israel has gone from being 12 tribes established in the promised land that God had given to becoming one mighty nation under David to now two divided kingdoms at civil war with each other, which is why, as the biblical story goes on, we read in the time of Jesus that Jews don't like Samaritans. They were once compatriots in the one kingdom. Now they are enemies because they've been at civil war. Firstly, this split between the north and the south has significant political consequences. Not only Israel divided against itself, both kingdoms are now far more vulnerable to their enemies. There's a lot of enemies up to the north, south, west, east, west. So they're all surrounded by enemies. And so splitting between the two now makes them more vulnerable. That's one consequence. Secondly, the split has significant religious consequences. How are the people who live in the northern kingdom supposed to worship God when the center of worship, the place to worship God, is in Jerusalem? How are they supposed to do that? See, if Jeroboam, the king of the north, allows the people to go down to Jerusalem, well, he risks losing their allegiance and that they'll then side with Rehoboam and accept him as king. So there's a bit of pride and ego sort of stuff here. So Jeroboam does something that's not all that good. He seeks advice from his assistants who convince him to set up two alternate worship sites. The next one there, Raj. So up in Dan and Bethel. So this one down here he puts close to the actual border so that people won't be tempted to go down Jerusalem. Just go to Bethel. It's close enough. It's on the way, right? So they'll stop at Bethel to worship there and way up in Dan so that the people in the northern half of the kingdom go up that way rather than tempted to go down here. But what he does, and this is the real problem, is that he sets up golden calves of worship in these two places. So rather than the worship of Yahweh, he sets up golden calves, which you remember was what was done at Mount Sinai. bad stuff, right? And what he does is he actually has the gall to say that it is these gods that were the ones who brought you out of Egypt. Not Yahweh, it's these golden calves. So I want you to worship these and give praise to them because they were the ones who brought you out of Egypt. So the Jeroboam, out of fear of losing his power to Rehoboam, leads the people of Israel even further into the worship of false gods. And this is the beginning of 200 years of religious and political decline for the northern kingdom of Israel. Over this period of time, they have 20 kings, and every single one of them is dodgy. Every single one of them succumbs to the temptation of idolatry and leads their people wickedly. It's not a good success rate for poor Israel. But God doesn't lose his patience with them. He sends prophets to lovingly but sternly warn them to return to the Lord. And this is where names such as Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea come in. No doubt you've heard their names or read the books that they're named after. These guys are sent by God to confront the king and warn them that if they don't repent from this idolatry and return to Yahweh, then their enemies that are lining up all around in these areas will overtake them and they'll be thrust out into exile. God's warning them, and he warns them for 200 years. A really powerful prophetic message comes through the prophet Elijah during the time of King Ahab. Ahab marries a foreigner called Jezebel, who Baal worship not only into their marriage, but into the kingdom. And they just brazenly start worshiping Baal, the king and his wife. So God sends the prophet Elijah to confront him. And this is a really cool event. Elijah challenges King Ahab, in a sense, to a duel. Not a sword duel or anything like that. It's different. Listen to this story. It's cool. But he tells Ahab to get all 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah to meet him on top of Mount Carmel. Now, Mount Carmel, again, was there last year. It's like really, really flat plain for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers, just really, really flat. And then there's Mount Carmel, plopped up right like a stage. So he gathers about 1,000 of these prophets, false prophets, up on top of this hill on one side of the hill, and then kind of Elijah is standing opposite them, and so all the people gather down the bottom and look up at this stage and see, okay, 1,000 prophets versus one prophet. Because Elijah says, I am the last prophet of the Lord in the land, down to one guy against 850 false prophets and King Ahab. So as the people look up, they see this standoff. And in 1:18, Elijah appeals to the people to make up their mind. And I'm going to read this story from the Bible. It's a little bit of a story, so stick with me. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let them choose one for themselves and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. As a traditional sacrificial process. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. Right? So Elijah has set up the terms of the duel. Put a bull on a whole pile of wood, but don't light it. And now we stand back and call on our gods to light it up themselves. Whoever does it, that one is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. They like the idea of that. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "O Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which was in ruins. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood," which is not a good idea if you're wanting something to light with fire, right? So they do it. He goes, "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Unfortunately, even this incredible public display of power doesn't have lasting results. Ahab's son takes over as king, and he just goes on and serves and worships the Baals just as his father had done. And this story continues with every king thereafter. At this point, 20 evil kings across 200 years. After warning, after unheeded warning, God's judgment finally falls on the northern kingdom. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire lays siege on Israel and its capital Samaria and sends the people of Israel out into exile. At this point, something is seriously wrong with God's plan of restoration. Under David and under the early days of Solomon, things were going great. But all of a sudden, things aren't looking good. This nation, Israel, has gone from the dizzying heights of the glory of the Davidic Empire and the establishment of the temple, being a holy people and on the cusp of being the blessing to all people God had called them to be, to now being wiped off the map with only the kingdom of Judah left. And we'll find out what happens with them next week. All the greatest, TV shows have a cliffhanger, don't they? So there you go. There's the cliffhanger for next week, is that we will find out what happens with Judah. But at the moment, Israel has been wiped off the map because of their disobedience. Before we finish, however, I want us to take some time to think through what this whole episode teaches us. See, as we've said throughout this series, we don't want this just to be a history lesson detached from us and our experience, because we can easily read this and go, that's really nice and informative, and I like the maps and I like the dates and all good. But it can be detached from us, and that is not the point. The point is that we would understand this so that it deeply impacts our understanding of our identity and purpose in this world, because this is foundational for our very purpose of being the people of God. So I want this to land for us. I want to make sure we're understanding God's word in a way that impacts us in the here and now, and that we learn the lessons that need to be learned. I want you to think about what this episode teaches us. I want you to think about what this episode reveals about the character of God in response to disobedience and unfaithfulness. Right? Israel and their kings were unfaithful and disobedient and didn't listen to the warnings of God. We learn a lot about the character of God in how he deals with that disobedience and unfaithfulness that actually helps us to understand how we actually are treated by God in the midst of our own unfaithfulness and disobedience.